Now, here's an interesting question. Is there an alliance? Do the Kurds, and are the Kurds in the Iran... Let me try this again. Clear my throat. Are the Kurds in Iran allies? Well, there's a very interesting author out there that wrote a book just before I wrote my book. In 2008, a fellow by the name of Robert Baer wrote a book called The Devil We Know, dealing with the new Iranian superpower. And he was making the claim in 2008 that we don't give the Iranians enough credit on a foreign relations sort of point of view. And so he was kind of arguing against that. Mr. Baer is an ex-CIA operative, and he's been involved, and he's been on the ground in Iran since about 1978. He makes the case that Iran and the Kurds have been allies in Turkey since 1991. Iran supported the Kurds in Iraq in 2003, soon after the fall of Saddam Hussein, and Iran has been in control of Iraq ever since. Now, let's sort of talk about the Kurdish history a bit and how they've expanded. 2,500 years ago, the Kurds were kind of a big deal. We were talking about the people that are the Medes, okay, that the Kurds are descendants of. And they were a leading power in the area at the time, and then along comes the Persian Empire, and then they fall in prominence. And ever since then, the Kurds, the Medes, haven't been a big deal at all. Okay, they're sort of a blip on the screen of world history. They haven't they haven't been prominent at all. What caught my attention that really caused me to want to write this book is watching what was going on in the Middle East about, from my perspective, about 2006. And I noticed that the Kurds were beginning to rise in power. Somebody that was a nobody for 2,500 years, it has begun to rise in power. And here's the thing, you can't have the ram unless you have both parties. You have to have the Iranians for Persia, you have to have the Kurds for the Medes, okay? So it wasn't until that time when I had both parties that could conceivably form the ram, okay? Now that we've talked about the history, let's talk about recent events. Back in 2003 up till 2011, when I was writing the book, the Kurds had really sort of taken over the northern part of Iraq. And then in 2011, when the Syrian civil war was beginning to happen, we see that the Kurds took over the northeastern sort of quadrant of Syria. And now, let's talk about the ram's plan. I saw the ram. Let's talk about the location of the ram before I read the verse. You'll see in Daniel, the early verses of Daniel, it talks about the location of the ram. And the ram starts out, because we're going to start talking about directions, we've got to start, where do you start from? He starts from a place in the Scriptures called the Ulai River. Modern historians believe that the modern Karen River is the river that we're talking about. And the Karen River, it crosses over from Iran into Iraq, and it's in the southern part of the country, very near where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers come together, and just before they go into the Persian Gulf. And if you remember me talking about the Shat al-Arab yesterday, the Karen River actually sort of feeds into that same tributary. Now let's talk about the verse. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. So it goes west first, then north, then south. so that no beast might stand before him, and neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his own will, pretty much did what he wanted, and became great. Let's take a look at this on a map. The Karen River, let's start with that arrow to the far right there, as you can see, is in southern Iraq. And then, and this was in 2011, when Saddam Hussein, in 2003, Saddam Hussein falls from power. Then there's a power sort of grab in Iraq, and Iran actually starts to take over Iraq, sort of behind the scenes. And then from there you go into Iraq, and then north of Iraq is Turkey, south of Iraq is Saudi Arabia. And so at that time in 2011, I said that the probable process that should happen in the future is that Iran is going to come in, and they had sort of already taken over Iraq. The next steps was to push into Turkey and to push into Saudi Arabia. In 2019, I just didn't carry the ball far enough, because what happened is they kept pushing west through the Syrian civil war. And now notice the nations that are north and south. We still have Turkey in the north, but in the south we have Jordan. And so that sort of changes things a little bit, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. But let me talk about Syria a little bit more. Some of the fascinating things about how Iran has moved west is, again, they've sort of taken over Iraq, and in Syria there are 80,000. Earlier in the year there were 80,000 troops that moved, Iranian troops that moved into Syria. And they have, and as far as I know, they haven't moved out, and I don't think they have moved out. And one of the things that's going on that I read in an article was that the Iranians were destroying places that would keep land deeds, okay, records of ownership of land and houses, okay, and which was a curious sort of thing to do. Why would you do that? And the idea was all these people that were leaving Syria that were Sunni Arabs, the Iranians, they're Shia Arabs, okay? And they don't get along. They don't like one another. And this is part of their power grab, is that they, by destroying these places that were keeping the deeds, they are basically sitting on that land, and all these Syrians now that have vacated Syria, that are in places like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey's trying to send them back to Syria, they don't have a place to go, okay? The place that used to be their home is not there anymore. We got many Christian organizations that are trying to help these refugees go home. And it's really kind of a futile exercise in that regard, because they don't have any place to go to. Okay, let me take you to the next.